Life is full of challenging moments. And in our self-confidence, sometimes we find ourselves in the struggle of doing what we thought we might never do. And for this reason, we ought always to walk closely and humbly with Jesus. As we are continuing through the text of the Gospel of John, here we come to John 18, verses 12 to 27, that reflect the beginning of the trial of Jesus after he's been arrested in the garden, and the denial of Peter in the courtyard. And we need to keep in mind that these two things are going on simultaneously, especially as John's Gospel reflects, as we will go back and forth in the text between him before Annas and Peter in the courtyard, back to Annas and Peter in the courtyard. But here we have, as we begin the text in John 18, verses 12 to 14. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. And we will note that text again in a moment. But here it is that Jesus is arrested. He was bound by the band, taken and treated as a criminal. They had gone with lanterns, torches, and weapons, as we had seen in John 18 and verse 3. He was taken to be tried, and as we put the gospel accounts together, we find that he was brought before Annas, as we see here in verse 13, and then to Caiaphas, as will be noted in verse 24, and the council, as we see in Luke 22 and verse 66. And then taken to Pilate, as verse 28 of this chapter, John 18, notes, and then sent to Herod, Luke 23, verse 7, and then back to Pilate, Luke 23 and sent to Herod, Luke 23, verse 7, and then back to Pilate, Luke 23, verse 11. And during all of this, Jesus was questioned and mocked and beaten and flogged and struck, blindfolded and spit upon at the hands of both Jews as well as Romans. But Annas and Caiaphas are mentioned together, mentioned as high priests together in Luke chapter 3 and verse 2. But two at a time, according to Josephus, Annas was popular with the people. But as we see, the text says that Caiaphas, the high priest that year, the high priest was put into place until he died, and then his son would take his place. But here we see that there are two at one time. It is said that Annas had 5 sons who also took a turn at the office, and then Caiaphas, his son-in-law. According to Josephus, it is noted at this time the Romans had almost made it into a yearly office. And so Josephus writes as a contemporary historian of that period and reflecting what was going on. But for us to think about a worldly government intervening and superseding what was supposed to be in place. But this is not unusual, as we see that kind of interference of a foreign government even during the days of the kings. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, changing his name to Jehoiakim, in place of Jehoaz, who had reigned only 3 months, and took Jehoaz captive to Egypt in 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 34. And the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar replaced Jehoiakim with Mattaniah, changing his name to Zedekiah in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 17. And so we see those examples also of foreign government stepping in and deciding who a leader is going to be. But as we think about Caiaphas' earlier advice, in John chapter 11, this was following the raising of Lazarus from the dead and the council's concern about what this was going to do as far as the focus on them, their position, and the nation, with people turning their faith toward Jesus. And there in John 11:49 to 53, we read, "But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." This is the reference that John was referring to here. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And so from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. However, Caiaphas did not have a clue of the good that Jesus' death would provide and bringing together the divine plan. He was just a player in all this, but it was God's divine plan. So here is Jesus before Annas. And then we step to look at what's going on at the same time in the garden. In John 18, verses 15 to 18, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. As Jesus said, the disciples would be scattered, John 13 and verse 32. And in Matthew's account, Matthew 26, verses 30 to 31, there we read, "Then when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee.'" You know, here Jesus had cited Zechariah 13 and verse 7, but we see that the two returned, Peter and a nameless one, and some have interjected other names, and some accept that this was John here who had followed closely, but they both entered in. Peter's heart was with the Lord. That is clear from his following so closely. He truly believed when others did not. As we see in John 6, 68 to 69, as others were turning, other disciples were turning away from Jesus, and Jesus asked the disciples if they were going to leave too. In John 6, 68 to 69, we read, Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." He had also been, he had truly seen himself as ready. In Luke 22:33, Peter had told the Lord, "Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death." And he had truly tried to defend the Lord, as we noted last week, John 18 and verse 10. He drew the sword, and he did swung it. He acted quickly and swiftly to offer defense for the Lord. But here, in the courtyard, Peter was not quite so bold. He followed at a distance, according to Matthew 26:58, and then he stood outside the door, and then he was brought in. In this place, perhaps Peter wondered what confession to connection with Jesus would have led to. Who, me? No, not me. In his first denial. Peter's character was a mixture of courage and fear. Have we not been there ourselves? He had acted rashly with a sword and placed his life on the line. But here, Peter seemed compelled by a spirit to seek safety, perhaps at any price, even the denial of his Lord. Perhaps he thought he could slip in unnoticed to witness what was going on here, but then here he is, caught off guard as he is questioned and asked about being connected with the Lord. Even as we think about our own life, it's hardest on us, isn't it, when we are caught off guard, when under pressure. It's at those moments that our weaknesses seem to surface. And so we need to be mindful of our weaknesses. We need to be humble as we continue to walk on with the Lord. But as the text moves forward in verses 19 to 24, we have the continued questioning before Annas. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Here Jesus was questioned regarding his disciples and his teaching. Was the goal for information, or was it just seeking incrimination? I think the purpose of the questioning here, as at other times during the ministry of Jesus, was to trap him and to let him incriminate himself rather than anything else. Most of this was merely a mockery of justice, because at this time there was no hope of justice for Jesus. But Jesus let the record stand for itself. And that's the way truth is. Truth will stand for itself. He had taught openly, as he declared. Openly in the synagogues, in the temple courts, out in the countryside, and in the open air. He had nothing to conceal. He came to reveal the Father and the truth of the Father's will. There was nothing in his teaching of which to be ashamed. The authority and the wisdom of his teaching caught the attention of all. And it was a glorious message that many have responded to. And so Jesus let the record stand for itself. As we consider how open the invitation of Christ is for all to come to him, so are the teachings of Christianity. No secret doctrines, no secret orders that have been set up. Nothing for private performance, no secret rites or rituals or ceremonies, nothing to conceal, as the open Bible is our plea. Christianity is to challenge the attention of all, as it is the truth to be reckoned with. Nothing of which to be ashamed, as Paul stated in Romans 1:16, of not being ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because it's the power of God unto salvation. And so there's no threat to study. No fear of someone digging up something out of the scriptures about Jesus that would be awkward to get over. We can tell people, and we need to tell people, read the book. Read the book. Believe the book. Believe the truth that is there. Jesus' response, though, was viewed as rude and disrespectful here in verses 22 to 24. He was struck. First, physical assault. With Annas not being a regular official, his followers may have sought with jealousy to see that he was given honor and given respect. They didn't see Jesus as doing that in the manner in which he responded, and yet Jesus still responded with self-control. Jesus responded with a gentle reproof of public injustice. He didn't avenge the insult, but justified his conduct. He practiced what he had taught in regard to retaliation in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 39. As one writer states, moderation, self-control, and courage marked all that Jesus said or did. Usually those who are in the wrong resort to violence. as noted by Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 23. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. That's what we see Jesus doing here and allowing the record of truth to stand for itself. This was also exemplified in the life of Paul as he wrote to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 12. It says, "And we labor, working with our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things." Are we willing ourselves to walk in such steps as that? Steps of our Lord, and even the example of Paul there. But Peter, still under fire by the fire, John 18 verses 25 to 27, we read, "Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. And so they said to him, 'You also are not one of his disciples, are you?' And he denied it and said, 'I am not.' One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Jesus had cut off, asked, 'Did I not see you in the garden with him?' And Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed." Peter's second and third denial. The pressure was increasing upon him. Peter revealed just how we might sometimes don't know how we will respond under pressure. But Jesus had told him in advance that this was going to take place. But his denial here we see was beginning to get even stronger. His accent was a giveaway. Matthew 26 verse 73 of a reference to him as a Galilean. He was faced even here with a relative of Malchus. And did this relative know? It says, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" And so here, him faced with, here's a relative, the one whose ear I struck with the sword. This was a point of desperation for Peter here as he's put on the spot. Matthew 26 verse 74, Matthew's account reveals, "Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know the man.' And immediately the rooster crowed." The rooster crowed. Luke's account in Luke 22 verses 61 to 62 we read, "And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, 'Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and wept bitterly." Consider a note from commentator William Barclay. He says there is one very interesting thing about the cock crow. Jesus had said that Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crew. Now, there are difficulties about that. According to Jewish ritual law, it was not lawful to keep cocks in the holy city, although we cannot be sure whether that law was kept or not. Further, it is never possible to be sure that a cock will crow. But the Romans had a certain military practice. The night was divided into 4 watches, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. to 12 midnight to 3 a.m., and 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. After the 3rd watch, the guard was changed, and to mark the changing of the guard, there was a trumpet call at 3 a.m. That trumpet call was called in Latin Gallicinium, and in Greek Electoraphonia, which both mean cock crow. It may well be that Jesus said to Peter, "Before the trumpet sounds the cock crow, you will deny me 3 times." And everyone in Jerusalem must have known that trumpet call at 3 a.m. That night it sounded through the city, and when it sounded, Peter remembered. Even visiting that region today, as those who describe the scenes that took place back then, this kind of reference is made of, rather than what I've had in my own mind is for so long is just a rooster. of it being this trumpet sound. The Greek of electorophonia is elector, a cock, and phone, a sound. The sound of the cock. The sound of the cock crow being the trumpet. But the sound happens, and Peter remembers what the Lord had said to him, and eyes met, as we see here in Luke chapters 22 and verse 61. Jesus had prayed that his faith would not fail. Luke 22 verse 32. And someone has suggested the look may have been a hint to flee the scene of danger. And yet I focus on that eyes meeting of Jesus' pity and his love for Peter there, and connecting and wanting him not to give up. But Peter remembered his fall and weakness in the moment was humbling for him. He thought he was so strong, but he was not as strong as he thought he would be. He could see strength was not in himself. And so Peter was deeply sorrowful. Denial. This incident may produce a warning against relying too much upon religious feeling. Peter felt deeply and warmly towards Christ, and yet he fell. Many Christians think that they are secure because the gospel touches their emotions. But are we strong in the Lord? Before we beat Peter up too much, let us again remember his zealous heart for the Lord. He did draw the sword. And let us remember that he was the only one who had earlier stepped out of the boat into the water to walk toward Jesus. He wanted to be where his Lord was. And remember also, while others scattered, he had been willing to follow into the courtyard. Yes, he wanted to be close to the Lord. He loved the Lord. He was devoted to the Lord. But what can we learn from this for ourselves when we recognize at times our own weakness? Rather than being defeated by that, do we recenter our focus? Let us recognize that we can have a right heart and still fail in the moment, like Peter here. However, let us not kick ourselves to the point of giving up. Let us resolve to rise again and to press on with the Lord as we trust his guidance and as we rely upon his strength. We know Peter's later boldness and even his rejoicing along with the other apostles and being counted worthy to suffer for the name, as noted in Acts 5, verse 41. He was still in a state of becoming, as we also are in a state of becoming what the Lord wants us to be. May we humbly take Jesus' warning to heart that he gave where we read, talking with Peter and the three there in the garden. Matthew 26:41. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We need strength beyond ourselves. Yes, we may have a heart for God, but there will be those times when we will struggle. And we find that we are not quite as strong as we thought that we were. But let us be humble. Let us not rely upon our own strength, but let us look to the Lord for strength. Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might, as Paul urged in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 10. Let us continue to draw close to the Lord, but let us look to him to strengthen us as we humbly follow on in faithfulness to him.